In this course section, we are going to dive into animating React apps and components. We are going to learn how to move from static styles and components to animated styles and components with smooth transitions and simply animations that look good and lead to a better user experience. For this, we're going to explore CSS transitions and animations, and we'll see when those are enough and why they sometimes are not enough, why just CSS animations sometimes don't do the trick. And then, therefore, we're also going to dive into some third-party libraries which we can use, one specific third-party library to be precise, that helps us with providing animations to React components. That's what we're going to do in this course module. Now, for this course module, I prepared a demo project. And this demo project actually uses class-based components instead of functional components and hooks, simply because I created this project here already for the older version of this course, which used class-based components only. But it should be fairly easy to get into this project as well, and definitely check out the course section in this course on class-based components if you're struggling to understand this attached demo project. In the end, it is a regular React project though, with some React components, and specifically in this project we got 3 React components, a backdrop, a list, and a modal component. And if we install all the dependencies in this project with npm install, and we then start the development server, then we see a website where we always have this modal overlay. And if we then go back to our code in the app component and comment out this modal and backdrop, and we then save this and then go back to our site, then we see this demo application where we got a list where we can add list items like this, and you see the code that runs behind the scenes for adding the list items in the list component. And throughout this course section, we now want to make sure that we animate both the modal, the appearance and disappearance of the modal, and also the list here. And for this, we're actually first of all going to start with a non-animation topic. We want to make sure that this modal is showing up conditionally. So let's start with that. So I'm going to remove my comments here so that we again show it all the time. And in the modal.js file, I got an on-click listener on the dismiss button where I emit this closed event. Now, let's say I want to control whether the modal is displayed or not inside this modal JavaScript file for now by simply showing or hiding the modal. Now, that is of course something we can do. And we can easily do this by going into the modal CSS file where we define a style for this. I'm, by the way, not using CSS modules here, but still, this is the only file where I use this modal CSS class. So there, we could control whether this modal is visible or not by adding a modal open class to it when it should be shown, and a modal closed class when it should not be shown. And then, of course, one trivial way of controlling this is to set display to block when we have modal open and display to none if it should be closed. And we should do the same for the backdrop. So in the backdrop CSS file, I'm also going to add backdrop open and backdrop closed. Now with that, we just have to add some code to both files to make sure we actually take advantage of that. So first of all, I'm going to refactor this backdrop component function here into a function with curly braces, where I then will return the JSX eventually. But before I do so, and that's the reason why I converted this, I want to create my classes array basically. So my CSS classes I want to attach here should be an array. It should always be backdrop, but then it should be backdrop open or closed depending on some prop I receive. So let's say I check if props show is true, And only if that is true, I want to add backdrop open. Otherwise, I'd add backdrop closed. Now, finally, what I need to do is I need to attach this class here. So the CSS class is constant and call join to join this into a string. Now with that, we can control the display of the backdrop. I'm going to copy that code into my modal.js file, and there too, I'll refactor this to take advantage of the fact that we do have a function where we don't just return something, but we will return something. Before we do so, I also want to control my CSS classes here. So let's make sure we return the JSX code here too. But then, as I just said, we should have CSS classes where we have modal, and then we have modal open or modal closed. And I actually use that as my CSS class name here. Again, joining it into one string with that join method. Now with that, we just need to pass the show prop to backdrop and modal. We can do that in the app.js file. There we have a class-based component. Let's now add a state where we add modal is open and set this to false, let's say, at the beginning. And then I will simply change this state. So in this class, I'll add show modal. That should be a function where I simply call this set state and set modal is open to true. And then I will have a close modal function. And that, of course, is all pretty much straightforward, nothing new. In the close modal function, I will set modal is open to false, just like that. Show modal and close modal. Now, in the modal component, again, I do call this closed prop on a click on the dismiss button. So that is, the closed prop, is what I should bind to my close modal method here. So closed will be equal to this close modal, and the backdrop and modal now both need to receive the show prop. That should be this state modal is open, because that will determine whether we want to show or hide the modal. Finally, we need a way to show the modal, and we got this open modal button here. Now all we have to do is hook up the on-click listener there to this show modal. And now with all these things, if we save this, we go back to the application, I click open modal, we see the modal, I click dismiss, we dismiss it. Now that's all nice, but we have no animation. So again, finally, let's work on this animation in the next lecture. So we want to be able to show or hide the modal. And in general, when working with animations in React apps, we got multiple ways of doing that. The easiest and straightforward way is a way which has nothing to do with React, using CSS transitions and animations. Let me show this at the example of the modal. Let's say we want to have it fly in from the top and also change the opacity, and do the same when we close it. We can do this by setting the opacity to 1 if modal open is attached, and by using the transform property to translate y, which slides it on the y-axis, by 0. So this basically says use the position it should have by the way we positioned it in our HTML code. So the default position in this case. Now we can attach the same to modal closed, but now here opacity would be 0 and translate y could be minus 100% to move it up by 100% when we have the closed class attached. Now, if we save this and I click open modal and I click dismiss, we see no difference. Now, let's actually also add a transition property to the modal, and this is a default CSS property which allows us to specify some CSS properties which should not be applied instantly, but instead be animated over time. Again, this has nothing to do with React. And here we could say we want to transition all properties, so no matter if we change the opacity or we transform this, we want to animate this. Then we can define the length. So let's say we want to do this over 0.3 seconds. You could also type 300 milliseconds. And all the details about transitions can be found in an article linked at the end of this module. This is just a quick introduction. This is, of course, not a CSS course. So over 0.3 seconds. And then we can define a timing function like ease out, which defines basically how the animation is distributed over that time. You could use linear to always move at the same speed, but with ease out, you actually make sure that you start faster than you end. Now with that, we make sure that we want to animate this. If we now save this file and we go back and click Open Modal and dismiss it, we see the same as before. The reason for this is that we also changed display block and none. This basically prevents any animation from happening with transition, because CSS doesn't recognize that it makes sense to animate it. Because to CSS, it's hidden anyways by default, and then it's instantly shown. So why animate anything in between? It would have been hidden until the animation ended anyways. And the display property can't be transitioned. So let's instead remove display here, like this. If we now go back, we still don't see the modal, but if I click Open Modal, you see it slide in, and if I dismiss it, it slides out. The reason for this effect is that by default, the modal now has this opacity of 0, since the modal closed class is attached if the show property is false. And it is false as long as we haven't clicked the Open Modal button. So therefore, we now got this nice animation. And now here is one important takeaway. Animating it like this is perfectly fine, and for this kind of animation, that might be the best possible solution even. Because you're using native CSS features, which tend to be quite well performing. And if you don't need more control than that, you got all you need here. We got animation for opening and closing the modal. So that's an important takeaway. CSS transitions, as you learned them in any CSS course you might have taken, are a fine way of animating a lot of things in CSS. And actually, we're also using a CSS transition in our course project for the modal. Still, I want to dive into some other options and also limitations of CSS transitions. So let's see what else we can use. In the last lecture, we added CSS transitions. Now, one obvious thing we can use instead is a CSS animation. Now, in case you're not aware, a CSS animation also has nothing to do with React. A CSS animation simply allows you to define a bit of a more complex and controlled animation than with the transition prop. Because with the transition prop, we're just saying, hey, whenever any property changes, animate that change and figure out how to animate it on your own, basically. Now, an animation, a CSS animation, is a detailedly described set of steps you want to execute. For that, you create so-called keyframes with add keyframes. Then you give these keyframes any name of your choice, like open modal. And then here, you can define the steps, so inside the animation, in percentages, or just with from and to if you only got 2. But we could say we want to start at 0%, and then that's the syntax. Then we want to have a certain state at, let's say, 50% of the animation, and we want to end with another state. Now inside these states, you use normal CSS properties to describe how the object should look like at this point of time. So since this is the open modal animation, we can say when opening it, we're starting at an opacity of 0, and we transformed this to be moved up to the top. Now let's say at 50% of the time, we want to have an opacity of 1, so it's fully visible, but we actually move this 20% to the bottom. So it's not in the final position, but actually moved a little bit too far down. And only at 100%, we move it to its final destination with translate 0. Now with that, we can use open modal in our modal open class, because this is the class which gets attached when the modal should be shown. And I no longer need to set opacity and transform here. Instead here I call animation. That's a special property which now allows us to define a set of keyframes which should be executed whenever this CSS class is present on an element. And that of course includes when it is added to an element. So here I want to execute the open modal animation. Then again, we need to define a timing. So let's say we want to show this over 0.3 seconds, or maybe 0.4. Then we also can define an easing function here, which defines how it moves between our individual steps here. And we also have to define if it should repeat this animation or end at the state we end at in this animation. If we don't define anything, it would jump back to the starting state once the animation played through. If we want to keep the final state, so the 100% state, we actually have to add the forwards value here so that it keeps the final animation step. Now with that, if we save this file and I click open modal, you see it bumps a little bit. It slides down and then slides up. Do you see this tiny bump here? That is because we push it 20% down after 50%. If you can't see it, let's simply increase this to 90% and then it should be really easy to see. Now if we open the modal, you see it jump down much further and then move back up again. So now we're using a CSS animation and we're taking advantage of the fact that this is simply added or played when this class is added. Now for closing, we can of course also define a set of keyframes. So let's quickly add close modal here. And now we want to play the opposite. So we start at an opacity of 1 and are at the position, well, the element sits at. After 50%, we maybe have an opacity of, let's say, 0.8, so still quite visible. But we slit this down a little bit. And then after 100%, we got an opacity of 0, and we move this out of the screen with minus 100% on translate Y. Now we only need to use the close modal animation, and like for modal open, we make sure that this gets added whenever the modal close class is added. So there we play the close modal keyframe set. Now with that, if we save this, let's see it in action. Opening works as before. Dismissing also now plays our animation. And that is of course quite nice, because now we're again controlling everything with CSS, but we got more control than with the transition property, because the CSS animation property allows us to play our own set of keyframes, which we do here. And again, this has nothing to do with React, but it is important to recognize that this doesn't make it worse or bad. You can absolutely use that. And in a lot of cases, CSS animations might give you all the power you need to achieve certain animations or looks. Now, over the last lectures, we saw how to use CSS transitions and animations. And as I mentioned, using them is absolutely fine. Now, what's one limitation of using these animations though? We can see it if we use the developer tools to inspect our DOM. If we do this here, we see that our modal div and the backdrop div are always present. They're just not visible because we're actually animating this here. Now, that of course means that all our code, all our HTML code is always in the DOM and just not displayed because the opacity is 0. This might not be what we want. It populates our DOM with a lot of elements, which slows it down a little bit, and which also might not be the best case or the best way to do for accessibility. And it is not very React-ish if we in the end are back to having to control the display of things with just CSS. It's also not super bad. We do it like this in our burger builder in the end. And especially for this modal or some side drawer menu, this might be perfectly fine. But let's say we really want to ensure that we show and hide this differently. By not passing the show and hide property like that, but instead by using our modal is open state to really show or hide the backdrop and modal elements. I can of course do this by using a ternary expression where I check if this state modal is open is true. If it is, I want to render the modal, otherwise I render null. And I use the exact same logic for the backdrop to either show the backdrop or render nothing. This is rendering conditional content as you learn it throughout the course. If we go back and I click open modal, we just see it move away here actually. Well, the reason for this is that inside the modal we're still using the show prop to add the open or closed classes. And since we don't pass the show prop anymore here on the modal and also not on the backdrop, well, it is always considered to be false, and therefore inside the modal, always the modal closed class is attached and applies the out animation. We could of course fix this by still passing show on both. So we could set show on both to this state modal is open. We do it like this, we go back, we still have an in animation, and we now see of course that the element is added to the DOM. But if I click dismiss, we don't get an out animation because the element is instantly removed. The reason for this is that React in our app.js file doesn't wait for re-rendering this JSX and therefore removing the modal and the backdrop when the state changes for our animation to finish, because it's not aware of that animation. And it's good that it doesn't scan our elements which are to be removed for possibly running CSS animations. That would be a performance nightmare. So here we now see a limitation we have with CSS animations and transitions. Animating in, showing it, did actually still work, because adding the element, the modal, simply now also adds the CSS class and the animation therefore plays. But removing happens instantly. And that of course means that we get a kind of a bad behavior or look here. Now for that, we need other tools to manage this. Now let's have a look at which tools that would be over the next lectures. Let's have a look at React Transition Group. You can simply Google for it to find the GitHub repository of this package. Now, this package is not an official React package or not by the React team, but it's a package created by the vibrant React community. And it is a package which allows you to smoothly animate elements when they are added and removed to and from the DOM. Let's check out the main documentation. There you see how to install it, and then it also describes how it works and how it's used. Feel free to dive deeper into this to really see all possible use cases and what else you can do with that. But of course, I'll also show you how we may use it together over the next lectures. First of all, let's install it with this npm install React Transition Group save command. I copy that, I'll quit my npm start process, paste this in, and simply run it to now install and store this package in this project here. And of course you add it like this to any React project. Thereafter we can restart npm start. And now let's start very simple and see this in action. For this, I'll not even start with the modal for now, but we'll also soon animate this again. But I'll add a button here, and that button should simply show or hide a nice little block, a div with a background color. So there I'll say toggle, and below that toggle I want to render a div. Now first of all, let me simply add show block here in the state, and initially that is false, let's say. And then here below the button I'll check this state show block. If it is true, I'll add a div here. If it is false, I'll render null like this. Now this div will receive some inline style here with double curly braces to basically pass a JavaScript object. And in the JavaScript object, I'll set the background color to red. And additionally, I'll set the width to 100, which will be interpreted as pixels, and the height to 100. Now with that, let's hook up this button, and on a click on this button, I'll actually simply execute a method here. In this method, I'll execute this set state in the function version where I get the previous state and then simply return a JavaScript object where show block is set to not previous state show block. Like that. So now I'm basically just toggling between the display of the block. If we click this button here, we do instead see and hide that. And to make this a little bit less ugly, I'll also add a line break below our button here. Should be a self-closing element though, so that now it sits above open modal. Like that. Let's also quickly add margin auto to our div so that it is centered. And let's give our button this button class name here to also improve its styling a little bit. Now with all of that, if we save this, we got our toggle button toggling this red block. Now it might not have enhanced the look of our application, but now we can use this block to start playing around with the React transition package we just installed. If we check out the documentation, we see that this package exports one important component. It actually exports more than that, but we'll start with this one, that transition component. Now let me show you how this works. First of all, in my app.js file, I will import it. So I will import transition. You can name this whatever you want. It's a default export, but I'll stick to transition from React transition group / transition. So that's a sub package which gives us this transition component. Now we use this transition component to wrap what we want to animate. In our case, that's this div here. For that, let me temporarily get rid of our check here whether we want to render this or not. Let's say we're always rendering this. And instead, let's add the transition component and wrap the div with it, like this. That alone won't do much, but we can now use this transition component to control the display of elements inside of it, and especially the animation of these elements. We do this, if we have a look at the documentation, by setting this in property. That's an important one. This decides whether the elements wrapped inside the transition component should be shown or not. And the transition component simply manages 4 internal states: entering, entered, exiting, and exited, which we then again can listen to decide how our element should be shown. Sounds very strange. Let me show you how it works. So first of all, let's add this important in property to the transition component. In determines whether the wrapped element should be visible or not. So therefore, for our div here, we should bind it to show block. Only if show block is true, this div inside the transition component should be rendered. We also got another important property we have to set on the transition component, timeout. Now, timeout simply is a time value which determines how long this animation should be played. Or to be precise, since transition on its own doesn't play anything but just manages these 4 states I mentioned, timeout simply determines how long it takes to switch from entering to entered and from exiting to exited. And it's this in-between thing you can then animate. So here, let's say timeout should be 300, and that will be interpreted as milliseconds. Now with that, what happens is that inside the transition component, we can render something dynamic with curly braces, because inside there, we now actually should render a function. That's what the transition component in the end gives us back. Values we can use in a function, or only one value to be precise, the state. So in the simplest form, what we can do here, we can simply write an arrow function. That is why we need the curly braces. This arrow function should then of course return the JSX we actually want to render. And that could be a paragraph which outputs that state. Again, wrapped in curly braces since we're inside JSX code here again. Now I'll temporarily cut the div here to keep it in memory but remove it. Now with that, if we also fix the error I just saw, that in of course should be bound to this state show block, the show block properties in our state. So now with that, if we save this and we go back to our application, we see that we see exited there. because I am just outputting some text here with my paragraph where I output the state value which is given to us by this transition component. Let's see which other values this state value or argument can have. If I click toggle, you see it first switched to entering and then to entered. If I click toggle again, it's first exiting and then exited. And if that's too fast, simply bump up the timeout to, let's say, 1 second to have a little bit more time. Now if we click toggle, we see it's entering, entered, exiting, exited. And that's all this transition component does for you. It manages this state argument it gives to you in a function you pass as a child of the transition component. And this managed state property takes your timing into account. Now with that, we can of course go back to rendering a div in there, but not actually in there like this, but instead in our function here. So in this function where we get the state, I actually want to return a div. And now we know that state is entering, entered, exiting, or exited. We can of course take advantage of this to now manipulate our style depending on the state. So for example here, we could say that we want to set the opacity of this element to, and if the state is, let's say, equal to exited, then the opacity should be 0, otherwise it should be 1. Now let's see this in action. If I save this, now you see the div is still there. It's taking up its space, but it's not visible. If I toggle it, it's shown again. If I click toggle again, it disappears after this 1 second. Still, we got no animation right now, but we can see how we can use this transition component. Obviously, it would be much nicer to have an animation though. Now, to add this animation, we just need to tweak this a little bit. We simply have to add the transition property you already learned about. And let's say we want to animate any changes in the opacity property. We could also use all. So let's go back to opacity though. Let's say we want to animate this over 1 second using the same value as we use here in timeout, 1000 milliseconds. And we want to do this with these out. And all of that should be a string. If we save this, now if I toggle this, you see it's animated in and animated out. Now we got one important thing. We're controlling this animation with the transition. It's still always staying in the DOM though. But we can control this by adding more props to the transition component. We can add mount on enter, which simply is a Boolean prop, which says, yeah, if the in property is set to true, you should add the wrapped element to the DOM. And on the other hand, you can add unmount on exit to really remove it from the DOM if that's not true. If we now save this, you see no empty space, it's gone. But if we now click toggle, it's there again. If we click toggle again, it's removed. Still no animation due to the way we're controlling this. We're only changing the opacity here when the state is exited, which is too late. If we set this to exiting instead, which is entered right at the beginning, we click the toggle button to remove it. Now you see it fades out. So now we fixed the issue we had before. We still have an instant animation for showing it because we're not setting the style on that. But for removing it, we're taking advantage of these 4 different states, or actually the 2 different states for removing the element, exiting and exited. And as soon as we start exiting, we already set the opacity to 0 and we animate this, but it's not actually removed from the DOM until the entire animation, so this timeout here, is over. And now we really tell React to only remove this element after the given period with the help of this transition component. Now that was a lot of new knowledge. Let's apply this to our modal so that this hopefully becomes a bit clearer. In the last lecture, we used the transition component to see how it works and how we can use it to control whether an element is removed or shown. Let's now use this transition component on the modal to animate this. So for that, I'll again add my transition component down there, opening and closing. And in between, as you learned, we will get a function where we get this state argument, which is entering, entered, exiting, or exited. Now we also define what should be rendered in between. In between, I want to render my modal. So I'm going to cut this out here and enter it right there. We can remove this checked below that. I will leave this checked for the backdrop because I want to still show or hide the backdrop just like this without an animation. Therefore, I can also just set show like this to true always because it's removed anyways if I don't want to show it. Back to the modal. There, we now want to control this transition. So I'll set the in property to this state and then modal is open. If that's true, then the element returned here in this function should be shown or treated as entered. I want to do this, let's say, with the timeout over 300 milliseconds. Now what I can do is I can pass the state, and with that I mean this animation state stored in this argument, to the show property in the modal. Inside the modal, I then can take advantage of this to still attach different classes. However, what I will do here is I will check if props show is equal to entering, which is attached right at the start when we click this toggle modal thing. Then I want to play the modal open animation. Otherwise, and for that I'm going to split this over multiple lines. Otherwise, I want to check whether props show is equal to exiting. In this case, I would like to play or add the modal closed class. In all other cases, no CSS class will be added. If we now save this and we go back to our application, if I click open modal, you see the animation is played for showing it and also for dismissing it. And still what I can do is in app.js, I can also, if I just split this over multiple lines to have an easier time reading this, I can also still add mount on enter and unmount on exit here to really get rid of it. And still, if I click open modal, I get the animation, the same for removing it. Because now we're taking advantage of this transition property, which simply adds a delay before it is removed from the DOM, which gives us the time to play our animation due to the state we get and due to us using this state inside the modal component here, where I check whether we're exiting, which is the state right before it's removed from the DOM. And therefore, unlike before, this is now not happening too late. Now, we learned quite a bit about this transition component over the last lectures. Now, one important thing to, of course, know is that you can also nest this inside any component you want. So, of course, we could move transition from the app.js file into our modal.js file and simply wrap our entire modal with this transition component in there. That, of course, also requires us to import transition from that package though. So import transition from React CSS, from React transition group transition, like that. And now we just need to update our code and basically say again that modal is always present in our app.js file, this component. Show is therefore again back to this state modal is open. And now show inside the modal has to be used differently. Now show is a property controlling this in property here. So now this should be bound to props show, which is true or false now again. And therefore, when we control our CSS classes here, we should do that inside a function between the transition component opening and closing tags, where we get the state managed by the transition component, where we then eventually return our div, which holds the modal, and where we then, of course, no longer attach modal open and closed like this here on CSS classes. Instead, that's just an array with modal. Down there instead, in this code we return inside the transition component, there I instead now need to change my CSS classes and conditionally animate this. So therefore, let me restructure this to a function with a function body where I don't just return something, because before I actually return the JSX, which should be entered inside this function here, I of course want to adjust my CSS classes. So I will essentially grab my constant from up there and now configure it here to be either just the modal, or now again checking for state being equal to entering. If that's the case, then I want to use modal opened, this one here. Otherwise, if state is equal to exiting, and I'm using these entering and exiting classes to move in right at the point of time we start that animation. So if it's exiting, then I want to have modal closed. In all other cases, I'll have null. So same logic as before, but now inside the modal. If we try this out, we should still get the same behavior as before though. Now in the last lecture, we moved the transition component inside the modal, and then we're just using the same logic essentially. Now, still there's one thing you might have noticed. We set a timeout of 300 milliseconds, but the animation we play, we set up in modal CSS, actually takes 400 milliseconds. Now, that isn't an issue. It simply will not play the entire animation. That's the thing, which then of course might be an issue again. The timeout you set on the transition component determines how long the entering and exiting state for which we're checking will be held, for how long this is basically the state it uses. If you define a timeout which is much shorter than the animation you play, you simply quit the animation preemptively, because you switch the state too early. You switch to exit it, which will mean that the element is removed, and that of course might not be the behavior you're looking for. Still, it's not necessarily an issue if you set it up like this. However, one other thing you might want to keep in mind, or you might want to configure in some cases, is the timeout. The timeout right now is only our value in milliseconds defined as a number. What if you wanted different timings for entering and leaving though? You can set this up. So let me set this up by defining a new constant, and I do this outside of the component because this is not going to change. It's a constant not related to the component rendering here. This constant I'll name animation timing, and that will be a JavaScript object. And in that JavaScript object, you can define an enter key and give it a duration of, let's say, 400 milliseconds, and an exit key of, let's say, 1 second, 400 milliseconds in 1 second, so that we can really see a difference. So enter and exit, and that's important. These are the two types you can define. And as you might be able to guess, enter simply defines the duration it will use for adding this element. Exit defines the duration it will use for removing it. So now if we pass animation timing here, this object we just defined to timeout, it will use these values for the two different types of transition. With that, let's also adjust the animation in our CSS file, and let's say close modal there also should take 1 second. If we now save this and we go back and we click open modal, the animation in is the same as before, but if I dismiss this, it's much slower, over 1 second. And there you can see the different durations being used. So that's something to keep in mind about the timing. It can quit an animation too early, and you can also define different timings for entering and exiting. Now in the last lecture we talked about the timings. Now sometimes you want to execute certain code when the state of the animation finishes and not just change what you render to the screen. For that, you get various callbacks you can add. functions you can execute to a transition. I'll go back to the app.js file and do this on this transition component we used to wrap this red block. We got 6 different events we can listen to on this transition component. The first one is on enter. And there, I will simply execute a function where I console log on enter so that we can see when this happens. The second one is on entering. So let's print on entering. The third one is on entered. And you might, of course, be able to guess when these methods are executed. We also got on exit, which should print on exit here. And then you might be able to guess that we got on exiting. So let's also print this to the log here. And then we got on exited, like this. Now these 6 different props can be bound to functions as I just did it here. And then you can run any code you want. And they execute in this order. On enter is executed right before we enter the entering mode. On entering is then executed once we entered the entering mode. And on entered is executed once we entered the entered mode. Well, that's a lot of entering. Exit and so on behaves the same. On exit is used when we start the exiting mode, right before it to be precise. On exiting is then executed when we are in the exiting mode, and exited once we are in the exited mode. Let me save all of that and let's simply see it in the console log. If I click toggle here for the red button, you see on enter, on entering, and after this 1 second it takes, on entered. And the same for removing. On exit, on exiting, and on exited. This can be nice to create staggered animations, where you want to wait for one animation to finish before you start the next one. With these methods, you got all the control you need to find out what happened, what finished, what started, and then time your other animations based on that, for example. So over the last lectures, we learned a lot about transition. Now, sometimes you don't want to control the transition as we do here, where we get this function with the state and where we then manually attach CSS classes or change the style. We can, of course, do this. We are doing this in both the app.js file and our modal.js file. But sometimes you just want to have a couple of predefined CSS classes for the different animation states, and you want to make sure they get attached depending on the state of the animation. Essentially what we're doing here manually would be nice if that would be managed automatically. And turns out the package we're using has a special CSS transition component. So let's import that from the CSS transition subpackage. Let's also use it then here in our JSX code. CSS transition doesn't use any function in between the tags. Instead, you just enter the JSX code you want to output, like that. Class name therefore now can be set back to modal. Right now, this wouldn't have any animation. We just have the CSS transition element. If we now go back to the application, click open modal, now we actually even get this error right now if we're using it. The reason for this error is due to the way this component works. We need to add a special property to the CSS transition component, which is called class names. Not class name as we use it on other properties, class names. Because here we define which CSS classes should be added to the wrapped element, so to this div, depending on the state of the transition. It will always keep the classes we had on the element, like modal in our case, but then merge these new classes with that. Now, what are these new classes though? We can define the trunk of these classes, so to say. For example, we could name this fade-slide, and you can use whatever you want. Now, what this will do is that the CSS transition component will automatically cycle through a couple of CSS classes and merge them to the div here, the div it wraps, or any element it wraps, of course, depending on the state of the CSS transition or of the transition in general. The classes it cycles through are your trunk, so fade slide in our case, and then dash enter, which is attached right at the point of time it starts entering, enter active, which will be kept attached whilst it is in the entering mode, so in our case, whilst it is running through this duration of 400 milliseconds. The dash enter class, on the other hand, will be removed right after 1 frame. And we also got dash exit, which is attached right when we start exiting, and exit active. So it's our job to now add these various classes to our application in any global CSS file or a file scope to this component where we want. In our case, I'll add it to modal CSS. So there I will add a .fadeSlide.enter class. Then I'll add a fadeSlideEnterActive class. Then I'll add a fadeSlideExit class. And then a fadeSlideExitActive class. These are now all the classes I can define and fill with live, and which will get added to the wrapped element, to this div in our case, depending on the state of the transition. Now back in our modal CSS file, we got animations already. So let's take the animation for opening a modal, and we now could add it to fadeSlideEnter or EnterActive. As I mentioned, enter as well as exit will be removed after 1 frame. We can use these classes to do some initialization, like for example set the opacity to 0 at the start of the animation. But enter active and exit active is where we then play the actual animation. So it is here that I add the animation property. And the same for closing. I'll add it to exit active. I'll leave the other 2 classes empty, and we could of course therefore remove them. Now with that, if we save all files and we go back to the application, if we click open modal, we're playing the animations from before again. But now we don't manually have to assign CSS classes and join them together. Instead, now we're taking advantage of the CSS transition component, which moves through these CSS classes based on our trunk automatically. And therefore, you often find yourself using CSS transition. It often is the more convenient component to use, since you can control the entire animation in CSS code by simply defining these CSS classes. Now, we had a look at CSS transition at this component in the last lecture. There I explained that we set up this base class name, this trunk of our CSS classes, and the CSS transition component would then automatically expand this to a couple of different CSS classes. And that's the case. For some reason, you could also want to make sure that you still use modal open and modal closed, so that you essentially don't have to define these classes. For that reason, you can not only pass a string with your trunk here to class names, you can also pass a JavaScript object. And in this object, you can manually define various CSS classes that should be used for the different hooks. So there, in this object you pass to class name, you can define enter, enter active, exit, and exit active. And there actually are 2 more, appear and appear active, which you don't have to define. They also would have been added to your trunk. These are used, so appear and appear active is used for the first time something is rendered to the DOM, not when doing it conditionally by rendering it, for example, upon a button click or not, but if you hard-coded it into the DOM, like in our app.js, the h1 and the button is, so if it's always there, but if the application loads, that's of course the first time this gets mounted to the DOM, and you could animate this with appear. But appear is not what I want to focus on here. Instead, if you say for enter, I don't want to attach anything, then you wouldn't have to define it, or you just define an empty string. For enter active, you could now define the specific CSS class you want to add, like modal open. And then with that, you can break out of this schema of having a trunk and then dash enter active, and so on. So with this setup, you can define your own CSS classes, which should get added or should get used. Modal closed is the closing class. And with that, if we save this and we now open the modal, You see, we got the same animations as before, but now we're using our own CSS classes. So that's a tiny addition. This is some flexibility you have to really fine-tune this to your needs. Over the last lectures, we spent a lot of talking about transition and CSS transition because it's really super important. What, however, about our list? In this list, we're also, of course, adding and removing items, and it would be nice if we could animate that too. Because right now, if I add an item, it's just there, and if I remove it, it's just gone. What if we actually wanted to animate this? Well, we can do that. We can't do it with transition and CSS transition alone though. This wouldn't work. Instead, we'll have to use an additional component we can import from the React Transition Group package. This component is called Transition Group from React Transition Group, like this, /transition group is the subpackage. Now, Transition Group can be used in places where you output lists. So where you have a dynamic list of elements, like here in our unordered list. There, we can replace the unordered list element with transition group, of course also for the closing tag, like this. And then, by default, this would render a div in its place, so we can define the component property there conveniently to still render an unordered list element, so that we work with that, but then it will replace itself with this unordered list and still wrap our list items semantically correct. And then, of course, we had our list class. We can also still add this by simply adding class name as on any other element, which should be list. With that, if we save this and we go back, we see that it still works, but we get a couple of warnings here. Unknown event handler on exited, received true for non-boolean attribute in. Well, we're getting all these warnings because right now with our transition group, we're still wrapping a list of list items. And transition group can be used for animating lists, but only in conjunction with the transition or CSS transition component. They then both work as you learned it. So here we now can import, let's say, CSS transition to take advantage of these automatically generated CSS classes from React Transition Group CSS transition, like this. And now we can use that to wrap our list items. So here in my list items array, I can use CSS transition just like that. Wrap my list item with it, like this. Now I need to move the key to the CSS transition element here because that's now actually the item we're looping through. And now with that, if I save this, you see that we get different warnings now, that we don't have a timeout. And if I click this, that it can't find enter. The enter class it essentially tries to add to the CSS class. Now the reason for all these errors is that CSS transition isn't configured correctly. We need to pass class names, let's say fade, and we also need to pass a timeout. Let's say here we just hardcode 300 milliseconds. If we now set up CSS transition correctly, now it's actually doing something, it's animating something. Well, it's not animating anything, but it's not throwing errors anymore. And the important thing is that now we can start animating this. Now, you might miss the in property we used before to control the state of our transition. The special thing about transition group, and essentially the only thing it does, is it's able to handle multiple items. It determines whenever one element in the list changes, if it's removed or added, and it will then manually set the in property on the wrapped transition or CSS transition component, so that you don't have to control the in property, because you of course can't do that. You're having a dynamic list in the end. Now, with that, the management of the in property is the main difference. So now we can define our fade animation, since I set up fade as the trunk here, in, let's say, the list CSS file. And I'll add fade enter. Let's say this is my starting configuration where I set the opacity to 0. Then I'll add fade enter active. So whilst the animation is running, I want to animate to an opacity of 1. And I'll do this with a CSS transition. So setting transition here for opacity over, let's say, 0.3 seconds, since I defined a timeout of 300 here, over 0.3 seconds with a ease out timing function. I'll then add fade exit, and there we'll start at an opacity of 1 still, and then fade exit active. There I'll set my opacity to 0, and I also want to add a transition here to animate this. With all these changes, if we save that file, if I now reload my application and add an item, you see it's animated in. We have this fade effect. And the same for removing it. There it's also animating an element out, just, well, the wrong one here due to the way we manage this list with this key, which really is just the index. But still, you can see the animation works. And if you have a list where you have a better key, it would also not update this incorrectly. So this actually works. It's animating list items out too, as well as in, as you can clearly tell here. So this is the transition group component. In the end, just a helper automatically setting the in property on CSS transition or just transition. And then you work with these transition and CSS transition components just as you learned it over the last lectures. And with that, you got a powerful way of animating lists in your pocket too. So in this module, you learned a lot about React Transition Group. This package which gives us all these components we used to animate things in React, especially and most of the time relevant when we are removing and adding elements to and from the DOM. There are alternatives to this package. One popular alternative is React Motion. If you Google for it, you'll find the GitHub repository where you find more instructions about it. Now, React Motion follows a totally different approach. In React Motion, for example, you don't really define manually the time an animation should take. Instead, React Motion tries to emulate real-world physics to figure out the best timing an animation should take, and it simply allows you to define end and starting states, and it tries its best to use these real-world physics to emulate or to interpolate the state in between. You can check out the various demos on this page to see if that's an effect you want, and then of course dive into the docs linked here on this page and seen on this page to use this library. It can be tough to get started with React Motion due to its very unorthodox way of thinking about animations, and some animations are kind of hard to do with it. But it might be awesome for a lot of other cases and might give you this more natural looking animation look you might want for certain kinds of animations. Another alternative is React Move, for which you can also simply Google to find its GitHub page or official web page. React Move has two basic components it exposes to you, which allow you to animate single items or groups of items. Animate and node group. And with React Move, you always work with objects describing the state of an animation. React Move is heavily influenced by D3.js transitions, so if you know that, you might have an edge using this. And in the end, you can find detailed docs and explanations on how it works in its documentation. Here you do define durations, but you then don't just define styles like opacity and so on, but you can really control way more with that and build more complex animations with it. So this might be especially interesting to you if you have more complex animations. And some examples like this nice switching between US states can be found on its page. It also has an element for animating groups, like here, these bars. Now again, this is a little bit of a more complex library. It might also have functionalities you don't need. So I recommend starting with React Transition Group. But if you need more control, React Move is an alternative you might want to look into. And finally, there is React Router Transition. That's another library I want to mention, though I'll be honest, there are more libraries than that. And you can get the feeling of a new React animation library coming up every week. But React Router Transition is a very interesting and special one. It is, as the name suggests, there to allow you to easily create route transitions, so animations between different routes. It builds up on React Motion, and it basically gives you this animated switch component, which you use to replace your normal router switch with, and it's made to work with React Router version 4, which I cover in this course, or higher. And animated switch then does all the same the normal switch does, but it allows you to define @enter, @leave, @active, and then a class name here, which is set up like this, to allow you to animate the routing. So to animate the switching of pages. And that is something I wanted to mention. You can dive deeper on this GitHub repository where you find links to the docs. Because animating route transitions can be very tricky with React Transition Group, the package I showed in detail in this module. And with the React Router Transition package, it's so much easier, and it allows you to really build a nice looking, highly dynamic application and add these route transitions if you need them. So this was a lot of content about animations in React. As I mentioned, there are more libraries you can look into, and actually you could fill an entire course with content just about React animations. The key takeaways are that you should always think about CSS, animations, and transitions. A lot of things can be achieved with just these, and even if you fall back to libraries like React Transition Group, as you saw, behind the scenes you still work a lot with CSS transitions. You just have a JavaScript layer to orchestrate the addition of these different CSS styles. That's the key takeaway I want you to have in this module. And then it's up to you which JavaScript library you use. React Transition Group, the one I presented here, is nice because it gives you a nice little JavaScript layer you can add to your application to, as I mentioned, orchestrate your CSS animations. You can look at packages like React Motion if you want a more CSS independent solution, which still behind the scenes uses CSS, but which emulates real world physics in the case of React Motion, and which therefore might give you the look you're looking for. These are the things I want you to take away from this module. It's of course, as always, about practicing these things, maybe adding them to the Burger Builder or your personal next React project. As mentioned at the beginning of this module, animations can be very important at guiding user attention and providing a nice user experience. And I hope that with the tools presented in this module, you have a good, tool set for building and orchestrating these animations.